Our scripture reading this morning will be from Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. Ephesians 4:29. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear.
I mentioned in class that I was an English major, for whatever that's worth. There was a lot of silly classes that I sat through where, a lot of silly egg-headedness, but some helpful stuff too. And one thing that surfaced, I guess you could say it's a joke that you hear among English teachers. It's not a very funny joke because, English teachers. But it was a joke about exclamation points I remember hearing, and they said, I can't remember who said it, but there was some guy who said at one point, he says, when it comes to exclamation points, you only get to use 5 during your lifetime. You only get 5. And it's only half serious, of course, but still a valid concept. When it comes to exclamation points, sometimes we get carried away. We probably have all done that. If you put an exclamation point at the end of every sentence, they start to lose their power. You don't even see them anymore. And that's why if you do that, or if you've seen people who do that, that's why you eventually have to start using 2 or 3, because you have to really emphasize certain things. And all of us have gotten carried away. Exclamation points can feel like some muscle that you've added to your statement, and it's tempting to overuse them. I find it interesting that now with texting, we use exclamation points even more. If you don't use an exclamation point, you can come across as angry or sarcastic. I don't know if you've fallen into that trap. That's something that I kind of think about. If you just put "have a good day" with no punctuation, you could come across as sarcastic, maybe. I don't know. So you without an exclamation point or at least an emoji, might not sound very sincere. So you basically have 2 choices. Either you have to be emotionless or bubbly. And so the English teachers are trying to teach us something. When you're writing certain words, it's important to consider whether or not what you have to say has enough power on its own. Does it need that exclamation point as a crutch to kind of boost things? Hopefully what you have to say has enough potency about it that you're not going to need it. If your statements need exclamation points, it might be an indication that your statement is actually weak. That was the whole point of what they were saying. Sometimes there's no strength on their own, and that's why we resort to the easy fix of an exclamation point. It's like, I don't know if this is a joke or not, but I heard that there was a guy who was somewhere where the preacher, I guess, was getting ready to present the lesson, and he wandered up here, and the guy's notes were up here, and he looked, and it said, "Shout here, weak point." So that tends to be the tendency, the temptation is I don't have a very good point, so if you turn up the volume, it sounds better. I remember Joe's recent lesson, he was talking about the riot in Ephesus in Acts 19 and how they were just shouting about Artemis of the Ephesians, and it was loud and repetitive. They just kept chanting this phrase over and over. It was loud, it was repetitive, but it had no legitimate impact. And his point was, in direct contrast to a Christian, hopefully doesn't have to shout or be repetitive. We're just the voice of reason. But there are a lot of worldly arguments like that. It's just a bunch of exclamation points. And we can see it in ourselves. Sometimes when we get angry and you start getting louder, that's kind of a symptom of using, I guess, audible exclamation points. If you're reduced to shouting, that probably means you're losing the argument. If everything you're saying is made of exclamation points, usually, not always, but usually it's an indication your argument is crumbling. Your logic is falling apart, and so you're trying to nail it back together with exclamation points. Anger does not always mean that you're wrong, but it's one of the common symptoms that someone is in error is when they get mad. And I know that after the fact, we'll look back and we can see it. It's hard to see it when it's happening. But regardless of all this, the issue still stands. Too many exclamation points make them lose power. It's the law of diminishing returns. The more you use something, the weaker it becomes. And that's why we end up using 2 or 3 exclamation points, why we can end up yelling. Maybe the joke is a good guideline. 5 is plenty for your whole life. So maybe use them wisely. And of course, for a Christian, this is a concern. We know the power of words. We know they can cause a lot of damage. Matthew 12:37, even straight out, Jesus says, "For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." It matters what we say. That's Matthew 12:37. It's a big deal, the words that we choose to say. James 1:26, I often think about this verse. It's important to notice in James 1:26 that how I speak, what I say every day is a deal breaker when it comes to my soul, my relationship with God. Here's what James 1:26 says. "If anyone thinks himself to be religious and yet does not bridle or control his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is worthless." It means if I'm not controlling my words in any fashion, all of this is a waste of time. So the challenge is to be careful about words, and that comes in a variety of situations today. And especially I've noticed it, I'm sure you have too, anyone on social media, I'm sure you've noticed that when people can hide behind a distant screen, they tend to get more vicious. And the same problem can show up behind a steering wheel. So it's nothing new. There's always been certain ways to reveal how we can misuse words and how we abuse words. I even came across this in 1905. This writer was talking about newspapers. You remember newspapers? And he was writing about newspapers, and he was pointing out that a lot of journalists would deliberately publish things that were sensational or vulgar or startling to make people mad, and that way they would write letters, and they would end up writing half your paper for you. And you can kind of see that again in social media and things like that. People try to trigger things or just to get attention. And again, it comes down to abuse of our words. But when it comes to words, Christians have to answer to a higher standard. We control our words. David just read Ephesians 4:29. And boy, this covers a lot. It says, "Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth." Not one. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth. I would maybe add to that from your pen or from your keyboard. But only such a word as is good for edification according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. It doesn't say, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth as long as you keep it, quiet, or just between the two of you, or if you follow it with bless their heart. That's not how it works. So you'll notice, I noticed at least 3 things in this passage in Ephesians 4:29. No unwholesome word. The idea there is that let no rotten word. That's a fair translation. We know the damage that words can do. We don't just let our mouths run. I notice on shows a lot, movies, television, there are characters who are just, let loose on what they have to say. And then they just follow it up, later and say, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it," and then it's all good. And I get that. I'm so grateful for being able to get forgiveness for things that I've said. But that doesn't mean we just let loose and abuse that license to say whatever we want. We control our words, because words can do a lot of harm. They can also do a lot of good. I like Proverbs 12:18. This uses an image that comes to mind often and reminds me about the things that I say or don't say. Proverbs 12:18. "There is one who speaks rashly like the thrust of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing." We don't indulge in angry exclamation points. We are always challenging ourselves to control what we say. There's probably a lot of stuff that we say that we shouldn't even say, not even to ourselves. And then Ephesians 4:29 says to not, use unwholesome words. And then verse 29 also says, only such a word as is good for edification. To edify means to support, to encourage. Part of the reason we don't say mean things as Christians is because hopefully we're too busy trying to think of good things to say. Instead of putting a bullet in the chamber to try to say something mean, we're kind of unloading and making sure that that's not happening. But also we're very busy looking around saying, okay, what can I say that's good? And then that takes the place of that. Even towards those who aren't doing the same for us. Romans 12:14 commands us, bless those who persecute you and do not curse. So that's again another challenge. Even though somebody may be abusing us with words, we do not respond in turn. So every morning we answer to the King. Kind of important to keep that in mind when you get up every day. So okay, I belong to the King. A key part of your mission for the day, if you think about it, I'm getting up in the morning, answer to the King. Okay, what am I doing today? Part of your mission for the day is to make sure that you encourage someone. You should not see your pillow before you have encouraged someone. Not just for upbeat, this is not a command for just upbeat, optimistic Christians. It's for any true Christian, and especially towards other Christians we're supposed to do this. 1 Thessalonians 5:11, therefore encourage one another and build up one another, just as you also are doing. That's for everybody. Ephesians 4:29 also mentions, you probably remember it talks about no unwholesome word and to edify. And then it says something interesting, according to the need of the moment. And I bet some of your translations touch on the idea of good timing. It's important to have good timing. And in order to have good timing, that would indicate you have to keep your eyes peeled. I'll be the first to stand in line and admit that most of the time we're so focused on ourselves that we miss it. The reason we don't encourage other people, it's not because we don't think it'll make a difference, because we're too focused on ourselves. We're so busy wondering we're going to get encouraged. And we miss the moment. We miss that good timing. When I was thinking about this, an odd memory came to mind, and I apologize ahead of time for its strangeness. But we used to play this game at the swing set, and so you'd get all the guys swinging on the swing set, and we called it Frogger. And some of the people in this room have played this game. I won't tell you who. But what we do is we would stand on one end facing the length of the swings, and you got all the swings going this way, and then you ran through and saw how far you could get. That's why we called it Frogger. The reason I bring this up is one way you win this game is you pay attention. You study the situation. You're getting from one end to the other. You can't just casually move through life and say, oh yeah, it looks like this guy needs to be encouraged. You study the situation. You get up every morning and say, what's the situation? Here's a person, here's another person. We've got to get out of ourselves. If you're just selfish, you're not going to even see it, and you're going to miss it, and you're going to get to your pillow not having improved anybody's life one iota. It's important to study the situation. One of my mom's favorite verses is Proverbs 25:11. Proverbs 25:11. Like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. So you look around and you use your imagination. I know, boy, by the way, I bet I could be in your shoes and think about times when I didn't know what to say. I want to come up with something wise, but I didn't know what to say. But you have to look around, use your imagination. But it's really not that hard to just say, I admire you, or I think you're doing a good job, and I just want you to know I noticed this. But see, first you have to notice. You look around, you use your imagination, and I would add this, it's almost always good timing, isn't it? When someone came up to you and said they appreciated you or that they admired you for some reason, have you ever said, well, actually, this is not a good time? Have you ever thought that? I know some people will selfishly dismiss encouragement, this is not a good time. That, we're not talking about that. But most of the time, any time's a good time. The trick is you have to look past yourself. If you're not doing it today, if somehow, even though I'm being pretty straightforward about this, that I don't do this and you don't do this, if I don't encourage somebody today, you're not doing this right. In fact, if you're not doing it every day, you're not doing it right. Hebrews 3:13 says, but encourage one another day after day. Joe touched on this. As long as it is still called today. That's kind of a funny way to put it. Is this today? Is today still today? Yep. Then go. So that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. I'm pretty sure a lot of us would have very little time left over to be discouraged, to worry, to sin, if we spent more time and energy looking around to find out what we could say to help someone. And with social media and emails, we are out of excuses. If there was ever a time when Christians could encourage each other day after day, it's now. Have you ever heard someone say, I had someone email me or text me and they said something encouraging and it really ruined my day? The only thing is positive. The only thing is positive. I'm going to briefly talk about strong language. It's similar to exclamation points. It's used to artificially boost language. They're kind of similar. So there's the exclamation point and then there's the point of exclamation. Primary component of using strong language, please notice my air quotes. The primary component of strong language is shock value. It doesn't make any statement more valid. It just depends on its ability to offend, and if not to offend, then to amuse. There was a guy named Steven Pinker. I'd never heard of him, but he was a cognitive scientist, psychologist, linguist, and he teaches at Harvard. And this is an interesting thing he said about strong language. I think the reason that swearing is both so offensive and so attractive is that it is a way to push people's emotional buttons, and especially their negative emotional buttons. So strong language is an easy way to get a reaction without really saying anything clever. I find it, kind of ironic that it's sometimes referred to as adult language, and I never understood that reasoning. Adult language is when you start talking like a crude 7th grader, which doesn't seem to make sense. Adult language is not sophisticated because the adult and the 7th grader do it for the same reason, the shock value, to get a reaction. And I'll point out something, and if you pay attention, I'm sure you'll notice it. When someone can't actually think of anything clever, they'll resort to crude language. You'll see that with a lot of comedians. And you see it in everyday life. Cheap laughs based on cheap thoughts. And that's not always the case. I was trying to think this through. For some, I think the words just eventually settle in. I don't even think they notice. I hear people talking in line, and they're using what we might think of as foul language, and they're not trying to offend anybody. It's just become part of them. Psalm 109:18 came to mind. This is Psalm 109, verse 18. Listen how it's described here. But he clothed himself with cursing, so he wore it first. But he clothed himself with cursing as with his garment, and it entered into his body like water and like oil into his bones. It can just become part of a person. And they say stuff without even thinking about it. They don't even notice anymore. But I think it's safe to say it never makes them a better person. Share one more thing with you. Years ago, I had problems with my vocal cords, probably because I talked too much. And my vocal cords had some problems. So I went to the doctor and a specialist and said, okay, we're going to try something. So stop talking for 3 days. Not one sound for 3 days. And I won't ask you to raise your hands, but some of you probably think, I could do that. Some of you are like 3 minutes. I don't know. But 3 days, I could not say a word. I had to write everything down. And it's kind of like when you have laryngitis. If you start whispering to people, they start whispering back. I would write something down, and then they would write back to me. But I learned a lot during those 3 days. One thing that comes to mind, remember James 1:19 says, become slow to speak. I became slow to speak because a lot of times people would be talking about something, maybe my family or my friends would be on some topic, and then I would have a comment about that topic, and I would start writing it down to put in my 2 cents. But by the time I delivered my input, the conversation had moved on. So it'd be kind of like, what did the kids like at the zoo? And then I'd start writing down my answer, and by the time I got to it, the question was, do we need anything from the store? And it was a hippopotamus, and they'd look at me like, well, I don't know what you're talking about, and then there'd be all confusion. So I finally got to the point where it's like, okay, I'm going to pick and choose my input. And so I became very slow to speak. It's like, okay, now I do feel strongly about this. I'm going to make sure I have some input. But the main thing I learned brings Ephesians 4:29 to mind. Let no unwholesome talk. Everything I said during those 3 days was all over the floor, because after a while you don't bother to look for a trash can. I would just wad it up and throw it around. I write my comment, throw it around. So after 3 days, I pick up once in a while, but still there was a lot of everything I said was all over the place, and anybody could pick it up. And I started realizing I don't want to, I wasn't like swearing or anything, but there were certain things that I said that it wasn't anything blatantly or crude or unkind, but I kind of was getting worried about certain pieces of paper that maybe would be misinterpreted, or maybe was just flat out a little bit unkind. And I thought, that's not a good sign. I wonder if that would change things, that if everything we said just kind of became a word and floated through the air all around us all the time. I don't know if that would change things or not, but it might be good for all of us to consider what it would be like if all we said could be seen by anyone. So I want you to know, I've never met a person who doesn't have to work on the things that I'm talking about. Words are very powerful. They can be used to really hurt someone today, but they can also be used to really lift someone up today. Very few times are words neutral, I think. We call it small talk, but that's pretty rare. It's important to remember that being given the power of speech and the power to communicate our thoughts is a huge responsibility. It's important we use it wisely. And since that is the case, I'll say a few more words that need to be said. Since we're talking about words, here's something that needs to be said. If you're not a Christian, issues like this will be one of the many things that will gradually get the best of you. It'll be one of those things kind of like oil in your bones. It'll be other things too. It'll just become a part of you. So you need to know that. If you've turned your life over to God and you've been baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, things like this won't get the best of you. You'll challenge yourself, and you'll do better than you did yesterday. They won't get the best of you. And God will help you become a person where your words are the best of you. I hope this is helpful to you as we stand together and sing.